Hello, all. I see my studio is here and other folks are showing up. So thank you. Thank you very much for coming to the first of five um, individually curated speakers for the Wallenberg Studio 2021. This speaker that we have today is invited by myself for our resisting erasure studio. And she has a unique perspective on the concept of resisting erasure, not only as a researcher, but as an in-person, as part of her personal history as well. And I couldn't think of a better person to come and speak to us about this concept, about how it operates personally in her work, in her research, and in her teaching. So I would like to introduce to you today's speaker, Meena Agha, who is an architect and a researcher and was recently a 2019-2020 Spatial Justice Fellow and visiting assistant professor at the University of Oregon. Currently, she is coordinating a spatial justice agenda at the Flemish Architecture Institute in Belgium. She holds a Ph.D. from the University of Antwerp and a MA from Köln International School of Design. Dr. Agha is a third-generation displaced Egyptian Nubian, a legacy that infuses her research, interest in race, gender, space, and territory. Among her publications are, and I quote, Nubia Still Exists, The Utility of Nostalgic Space, the non-work of the unimportant, The Shadow Economy of Nubian Women in Displaced Villages, and Liminal Publics, Marginal Resistance. Her work can be found at Project Unsettled, all lowercase.com. So without further ado, I would appreciate if you would help me welcome Professor Agha, and we will hear her wise words to us today. So thank you, Meena, for showing.
Hi, hello everyone. So I am very excited to be invited to this studio. When Craig told me if my work has to do with resistance, and I said, of course, then we can have a theoretical debate on resistance. And then he sent me the site, and I just went into a long trip through the history of Africa Town, and I was so enamored in how this is a quintessentially African story and how it relates to the story of my grandmothers and grandfathers who got displaced by the Egyptian government all through the 20th century. So I decided that I'm not going to give you a theoretical lecture. I'm going to just bombard you with stories and see what happens. And I think I got overly zealous with all my stories, and I piled so much into this lecture. So if it looks fragmented, it's okay. It's okay that the stories get fragmented and complex and uncontainable, because this is what stories do to us. Let me share my screen if you don't mind.
You should be able to.
Okay. So do you see my screen fine?
Yes.
Okay. So as I said, I just compiled a bunch of stories for you, and they all come from my doctoral research, for which the funding was late. So instead of writing one of those sustainability proposals, as that's what gets you money, I just started writing about our village. about which nobody really cared. Like nobody really understood, why am I writing about a village in the middle of the desert in Egypt? Why am I not even comparing it to a European context so that I can get funding? So, but it was very important to me, as this was a personal question on who I am and what does it mean to be a diasporic self in this world, and what does it mean to find your African epistemic grounding. And I feel like this story might resonate with some of you and might really find its ties to what happened in Africa Town, or what happened spatially, especially in Africa Town, and this idea of how people, despite every single piece of injustice and dehumanization, especially how Africa and its children are able to carve a space within the cracks of the system, and how Africa can reproduce itself wherever it is, or African epistemologies can reproduce themselves within the cracks of really hegemonic systems. So my research had some main questions. So a question is, why would a marginal build? Why don't we just occupy other people's buildings? Why would we build in the first place? Why would we not sit there and wait for people to build for us? As is the case, I'm going to tell you later. And how can I then represent myself as an architect within this practice and find an imaginary outside the Eurocentric one in which our design field lies? And also, how do I, like my grandmother, practice space making and architecture emotionally? But above all, for me personally, how to be displaced from where I have never been. I was born in the 80s. The displacement happened in the 60s. I have been carrying, not just me, all Nubian generations, carry that pain of displacement. And it's not going to go away. It's going to go to my child and the next generation until we get our land back. But also, the question for me is not just how it happened, it's how to go about it. How do I spatially go about the fact that I am displaced from where I have never been? How do I then be that agent of erupting spaces, of the erupting space within the cracks of the system? How do I then become the agent of the against that erasure, that spatial erasure that happened? Let me tell you what happened. Well, Nubians have lived in the area that is now between Egypt and Sudan. So when you hear about ancient Egypt and the pharaohs, they lived between, if you see my cursor, they lived between this area all the way until this area. And then between this point and all the way until the sixth cataract of the Nile, it was the Nubian kingdom. But of course, the British colonizer came into the area in the 18th century, decided that this land is one land. This land is not going to work this way. We're just going to put a line between them and have Egypt be this territory until this, which is the latitude 2022, and this would be Sudan. Then Nubian land became. This was one of the first ruptures in the land, because a cousin became in Egypt and a cousin became Sudanese. And this is actually a very big issue within the Nubian community, because the borders don't make sense, because we don't speak the language. We speak our indigenous language altogether. We don't speak the language of people north to us or south to us. Our music is common to this area, and we actually are literally first cousins. So my first and second cousins hold Sudanese passports, while I hold an Egyptian passport. So all these kind of constructed nation states that required a certain kind of citizenship, a forced citizenship on indigenous groups within Africa, forced by colonial rule, has really created ruptures in ancient territories in the area. The Nubia was a land of the Nile. So people would build looking at the Nile. Nubia is nothing without its Nile. We are historically the worshiper of the Nile, and the relationship with water permeates into every single aspect of our life, which has been really destroyed by displacement. But this is my old village. So in the 60s, my grandfather owned this basin here. And I don't know which one, but one of these houses was my great grandmother's house. This took me so much work to find. And now, what happened is that the state has displaced Nubians all over the 20th century for the sake of dams. So, in 1902, the state built what is called the Aswan Low Dam. So, damming is at this point, the low dam and the high dam. This is going to get a bit technical. So, Nubians lived by the banks of the river. What happened, and this entire area was agricultural. What happened with the first damming is that it really submerged all this area and some houses. And they built the dam, and the water level had risen, and they did not tell people. That means water went into people's houses at night and flooded them to death. So we hear horror stories about how water that they have worshipped for years came into the night, that's in the very early 20th century, and just flood people to death. In 1912, they did the same thing again, because of why would they care about those Black people in the south of Egypt? Then there was the decision of the British colonizers. The Nubian territory for them was just a source of enslaved people before enslavement was illegal in the 18th century, and now it's just a non-worthy space for them. Then in the 1933, they decided to heighten the dam a third time. And what happened then, it was really devastating on a lot of the built environment. And then in the 60s, and this was the biggest devastation, it was done, however, in a systemic way through the post-colonial state of Egypt under Abdel Nasser, and it submerged every single piece of Nubian land within the Egyptian border and 26 train stations in the Sudanese border who were displaced way to the south, and we were displaced way to the north. This is the low dam. This is the smaller dam. Then it was built by English engineers. It was celebrated, and nobody cared to tell Nubians, well, water level is going to get higher. People pay attention. But what happened after the 1933 is that Nubians went to higher ground and rebuilt their villages. And Egyptian architect Hassan Fathi talks about how people rebuilt entire villages in 12 months, while the state then, which was the English colonizer then, refused to pay any reparations. And people have built their entire villages in 12 months, 30,000 houses. This is the part of the Nubian land that got submerged in the 1933. So even when you get drowned to death, you reproduce yourself. You reproduce your territory again. And then also Hassan Fathi, who is an Egyptian architect, and when I say Egyptian, I mean somebody from the north. It's a very iffy thing when it comes to identities, because when I don't call myself Egyptian, some people get really annoyed. So this architect said how marvelous it was to see 30,000 houses, none of which looks like the other. How can you build all this in the short amount of time with the uniqueness of every single house? Fast forward 80 years from that. These villages became submerged except for three. Three villages, survived by the Nile, while everybody else got sent into in the 60s, got sent into displacement villages that we are going to talk about later. And these three villages were the only three Nubian villages that got to stay next to the Nile. But because they have no economic backbone, what happened is that investors from Cairo and architects from Cairo decided that they want to build a touristic space in there. And they decided that they're going, if they leave the houses as is, these lovely white houses, it's not going to attract tourists. So they need to meet what Egyptians think of Nubians. So Nubians now have to so people from outside this area, people outside from outside this indigenous field of knowledge now gets to decide what Nubian architecture looks like. And if you don't comply with their image of your architecture, of yourself, you're not going to make any money. So what happened is that people all tried to meet that imaginary, which is basically a fantasy of people from urban area about who Nubians are. The happy Black people who wear colorful clothes and they are dancing all the time, which is basically the kind of stereotypical tourism fantasies of people who perform whiteness over African spaces in the field of tourism. And I wanted, and these photos are from 2006. So I did this in my field research in 2006. And in this short amount of time, the entire village that was white, it was pearl white because of the sun. It was we come from a very heated area on Earth. It's hot, it's really hot. So white is very important. So for environmental control, but now this doesn't make any money, so people had to go in and use all these paints that are not also from the environment, just industrial paints to try to meet that imaginary. Let me take you to the next historical point, the High Dam. And I opted to put this image here to talk about why the High Dam was this kind of disastrous thing. In 1964, Abdel Nasser was trying to build a new Egypt. He wanted a new pyramid. He wanted a new national project. He was also notoriously known for his anti-racist stance. And he was also known for how friendly he is to the African continent. However, the systems that have ran this operation, starting from building the dam all the way to the displacement of Nubians, was highly racist. It was the system that is already embedded within the Egyptian social fabric. It was a system that was already embedded by the colonial regime. As Timothy Mitchell says, how post-colonial states did not really abandon colonial systems. They just perpetuated them and relabeled them. So the High Dam has caused the displacement of my people. So my family was displaced by the High Dam in 1964. And it was one of the most devastating things that can happen to somebody, being cut from your land and being cut from your ancestral soil for just like that. And the biggest issue, actually, and this might be very interesting for you as when you think about what happened and people coming in the ship and death, is that the issue was that people were going to be displaced away from their burial grounds. So you cannot take the remains of people your people who were dead. And that's a death sentence, because the death within an African episteme does not really happen with the expiration of your body. You actually can extend the social life of somebody through visiting them and through regenerating them, through keeping their story open, also through keeping their house open. How the house becomes this extension of a body, it's the extension of the person's flesh. So there are so many spatial mechanisms that had to do with keeping people alive. And having all these spatial mechanisms drowned means this is a death sentence to everybody who is buried in that area. So this was one of the biggest issues, to leave the dead, to leave the people who are buried. And people were packed into buses, they were packed into ships, and then they were packed into buses, and then they were packed into other ships and other buses, and it was a very long and grueling process. Did somebody say something?
No.
Okay. Okay. So we fast forward to now we have a whole population displaced into this area. So the people who lived under all this line of water are now concentrated in this area, which is basically a big uh, planned prison, as it's a water canal all around it, and there are three entrances, and all three entrances are packed with soldiers, so nobody can come in and out if they feel like they are suspicious. I can't really take a journalist in. Like I can take some white people into the space, and soldiers would let us really go. And then they promised Nubians they're going to go live in this new paradise, and they are going to own land. Their struggles are over. They're going to go into prosperity and modernity, and of course that was not true. My grandmother tells me they backed us into ships like animals with our animals, and then they decided that animals are must be quarantined, and then they never gave them back to us. So that's wealth being lost. And they went from their land by the river and palm trees into this state-built project in the middle of the desert. And here starts the 50 years of grueling spatial resistance. How it's the built environment and people are in contestation and in war or in fights over and over every day from the day of displacement till now. People went into their places of displacement. The state said they built 17,000 houses. Remember, in the 30s, people rebuilt 33,000 houses, and this was just a partial displacement. Now, 17,000 houses was not nearly enough. People went there, and the state agents told them, here is a chalk line on the ground, that's going to be your house. So basically, people in the middle of the desert, and most of them were in the summer, that's dangerously hot to have no roof over your head. Plus, none of the houses were roofed. None of the houses had doors. So it was pretty much just shells, and people had to rebuild their entire space anyway. It's like Nubia, this place. The thing is that the state called this New Nubia, and we never call it New Nubia. We call it Tahgir, which means a place of displacement. So you would stop a car or a taxi or a microbus and ask them if they're going to the place of displacement. Nobody except for the state uses the term New Nubia. I think they also abandoned it. They're using something else now, but this was the hope that this would be New Nubia, but Nubians really rejected it. This is a house that the state offered, the gray one. This is how they got it, and people had to do all kinds of modifications on it, especially this bench right here. The Nubian house was 500 to 1,000 meters square in surface area. I don't know what is that in imperial, so you're going to have to do some math. It was a huge surface area, as it was not a place of shelter. It was a place of the political and the social and the making of oneself. It was a point of origin. And it was ran by a matriarchal system of Nubian elderly women. But then in displacement, the houses were around 100 meters square, which is 1/10 of what the Nubian house was before displacement, or less than 1/10. This actually is one of these terms of resistance. So some Nubians went into these villages and said, we don't want your houses, and went all the way outside the outskirts of the village and started building houses as they were before displacement. This one is built by my great-grandmother for her son, my great-uncle. And this huge house is occupied by 3 people. This is the role of the Nubian house, to stand like a small city ready for 150 people to occupy it for events of rites of passage or events of social importance. And all these buildings has not stopped since 1960s to this day. This is a render from memory of my grandmother. So I do use renders to kind of get things out of memory and see what used to happen spatially in our house. And we had this guava tree in the middle of our house that used to die because of or used to be always sick because of the bad soil in the displacement villages, and they used to try to take care of it as if it's one of the it is as if it's the house pet. Although we had a cat as well that lived in the house, but it was also part of the family members. And I remember how my grandmother was there taking care of that house that was cracking every 10 years because of that bad soil, and trying to maintain the house as the core of our being, as the point of origin. As you see the cracks back there. This is our traditional garb, the garb for all Nubian women. And you see the cracks there. Every 7 years, every house within these villages will crack completely, and people will have to rebuild it. So it's like an Olympus thing. You are just building and it cracks, and you build and it cracks. And here is my favorite piece of architecture ever. This bench. It's called the mastaba, and that's an Arabic word. And in my assessment, the use of the Arabic word was to make it less intimidating to the state agents who saw all these benches being built in front of houses. The state built the smaller, like the inner frame of the house, and people started adding these things. And the mastabas, after 3 years of displacement, was all over all displacement villages. It was an effort spearheaded by women. This element is our first interaction with the outside world, but it's also a term of refusal of the domestic space and the private space. The Nubian house is neither domestic nor private. The domesticity that starts at the fact that you come as a wild being or a biological non-social, and then become domesticated, and then go to the public space for the social, to be social, is not compatible with African epistemologies. And the fact that there is a private space and a public space, and the private space is for women and the public space is for men, and this kind of duality and segregation is also ontologically inapplicable within African epistemes. So what happens is that this bench becomes a line of suspension to these dualities against this kind of architecture that imposes different epistemologies and imposes different ways of life, that and erases what a Nubian house is, a Nubian house as the point of origin. The African house in general is the point of origin, the story, the myth of origin. It's not the place of domestication, it is the place of becoming. And also it just brings the house outside and that brings the inside in. Let me show you some cool things it does. So there were no windows when the state offered these houses, and people started opening windows to the mastaba. And this, we never used the door when we were young. We would just step in and out, and there is a bench on the other side of this. So like as you see here in the lower image, and you just jump in and out, and this kind of blurred line between the inside and the outside. This is how it looks like in our village. Every single house that is occupied has these kinds of elements in it, like just a comp that takes the street and gives it to the house. And these are so many things that the mastaba allows you to do. If there is a mastaba, you can choose to not sit on it and sit on the ground in front of it, because it basically claims ownership over the ground next to it. And the funny thing is that usually these seatings when elderly Nubian women are streets where agriculture should pass. So this is where agriculture should this is where agriculture should should, like, the trucks with all these crops should pass to go to go to the markets, the bigger markets and so. But no driver would dare drive and create dust next to elderly Nubian women. So they have to drive all the way around the village and not interrupt these streets. So the street itself and its land use that was designated within the plan has been changed completely. It became a living street because of these kinds of elements. And we often had the beds out in the summer and slept in the street, just taking the space out and refusing this line between private and public, this duality that is born out of doctrines of property, this idea of this is yours, that is a private, and that is for the public, which is never really for everybody. This is also in front of my other grandmother's house. Somebody's asking something?
Oh, keep going.
Okay.
I'm monitoring that.
No, not really. This was not for selling anything, because here's the thing: you don't own this mastaba. It's not you. It's attached to your house, but it's not yours. So you can't really ask people to leave it, because it just blurs this ownership. You build it, you attach it to your house. It basically overlooks the inside of your house, but it's not yours, and anybody can sit on it. But it also makes it that the space in front of it is yours to sit. And as you see, I don't have any real people in here, because the use of the camera is very violent within these contexts. Anthropologists and scientists have been shooting and taking pictures of people in an extractionist way, that the camera had this effect as like a gun. It's like you're pointing something in front of people's faces. And I have a bunch of photos of people that my husband had taken. He's not Nubian, and I was mortified. I was thinking, I'm going to get disowned. What are you doing? We don't take pictures of people. And I then had to recreate everything through collaging them. This is my grandmother's street. All these women live in these houses. They come every day in the morning. They sit here. They have lunch. Cars cannot go by. So their time there is cars cannot go by. Cars have to go all the way around the area and take the longer route, because Nubian women now took this street. And this is another kind of very interesting resistance. So because the Nubian houses were reduced into these small dwelling units, people lost this big space of the social and the political. So what they did is that they built a quasi house. It looks like a house. Any state agent, if any state agent comes in, it looks like a house. This is what I'm talking about. And it's basically a house without the rooms, and it becomes like a public, or not public. It becomes like a space, a proxy for the house. So if you have a wedding, you take the key for that space. It's furnished with all the things that you need for a house. There is a there's a financing system that works. This is just emotional capital, kind of running and operating a space. And then if you have the event, you take the key and you start using the space. Of course, it got, the walls were cracked. The community doesn't have enough money to kind of rebuild it. But this has been the center of our social life for those who have smaller houses, not big. No, they don't have a big house anymore like they did before. And this acts like a proxy house. And if there are no events, it sits silently. It does nothing. It's just closed, as if it's dead. And it's hidden. It's hidden, and I never thought that the state agents thought it's a house. So it was two state agents registered as somebody's house, because they did not want them to know that there is now a centralized space for gathering, as that would really freak them out. And at night, if there is a wedding, it would become crowded with people. I used to dance here all the time, barefoot. Good days. And It would be a big dining area if it's Ramadan, where people want to come together. It just acted as if it's a proxy of the old Nubian house that people did not have anymore. Some people were lucky enough to rebuild bigger houses, but most of the people did not have the funds and had to settle for the smaller state-built houses and needed this kind of proxy to act as the Nubian house when they needed one. And it was built by women, by the way. We had 3 in our village, and one of which was built by my grandmother. And when they say somebody built a house, doesn't that mean that they built it with their hands? That means that they how do I say it? Invested emotional capital in it, operated funding the funding through trust, decided on the orientations and the shapes and the spaces while sitting and feeding people and taking care of people who are building it with their hands. So if you look at this, then how does that inform the identity of the architect? Then who is the architect then? So can the architect be that emotional laborer? Well, within this episteme, I say it was. There is an empirical evidence that an emotional laborer becomes credited with the building process. See this, the red ones, this one, and this one. These were the hidden houses. It's called Madyafa, but to everybody else that is not Nubian, that is not from this area, it's hidden as if it's just a house. Other ways of resistance was really against this rectangular planning. So people started adding trees outside their houses, even though there is no sewage systems, and they have these septic tanks underneath this land, and these trees are really struggling. But they really did try to disrupt the street by creating shade, by creating these green spaces. And another one that I really love is that the key and the how do I say it? The lock of a house doesn't not make any sense within African epistemologies, because there is no property to protect. So a lock is something you use to tell people that you're not in your house. It was something big like this one. But the new houses then had these doors, which were installed like 2 years later, and they had these tradition, like just the locks, the very simple locks that lock from the inside, which doesn't make any sense for Nubians, because you would like to open the house from the outside. Why would you lock your house? So they just had this hole in the door, and if you're coming from the outside, don't need to knock. Anybody can go into any Nubian house. Just pull the string and go inside the house, just to disrupt this idea of the lock in the first place. And every house then created one room as an in-house museum. That basically this is something that really is hidden from even researchers of Nubian architecture, that there is an in-house museum that somehow maintains the lives of people. As I said, when we were talking about death, there are so many ways to avoid social death. There are so many ways to avoid for you to live beyond your bodily existence. And there was this is my great grandmother's chest with all her stuff inside, and with her prayer rugs next to it, and nobody gets to use them. This is now just a shrine to her and to her stories. So the Nubian village post-displacement is in a fight every day with modernist houses that are designed for the biological, private, domestic sphere that are not really compatible with a Nubian episteme. They are in challenge with spaces that are forced as being public, while they don't really meet what Nubians need in their social life. And there are also the other institutions of oppression, like schools and medical centers, that now start treating Nubians as the new subject of the state that need to be made into the citizen that Egypt needs, not the other way around. So, for example, Nubians are forced to sing in school the praise of the high dam that drowned all their land. And the nice thing is that spaces also can hide in language, because within the Nubian language, there are songs that we sing in every wedding, dancing to it. And within the song, we just say, "We wish the dam would break," which is something that would take you to jail in Egypt. If you would say something like this, it's a threat to public infrastructures, and you would be taken to jail for treason. So within the Nubian language, all these spaces and all these imaginaries then get to live. That's it. I just wanted to show you some spatial interventions on what happened, and the fact that it doesn't matter. The marginal will build for itself against erasure. The way we understand the space is the way we understand the world, through which we understand the world, and imposing a space and imposing an episteme on another one in a trial to make them assimilate to a larger nationalist project is a huge effort towards epistemic violence. And us as architects from these kinds of paradigms that are subject to erasure, and our allies should be very aware of our epistemic standing. Where do we stand? What does it mean to build? What does space mean? What, to me, for example, I really struggle when people start speaking about space and place, because there are three ways to ask where in Nubian. It's a space that is never geographic, is hi. Did I do something? Okay.
No, 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 no.
Okay.
Just keep going.
A space that is never geographic is that is not geographic or not material exists within this epistemology. A space that is inside the Nile, a completely imaginative space inside the Nile with its parallel people and parallel lives and parallel powers, also exists within this epistemology. And all these things become ways with which we understand life and we understand reality. And it also becomes policy with which we treat the environmental elements around us. So I was just trying to answer that question that I said in the beginning about how to be displaced from where you have never been, and trying to answer the aspect of how do we go about it. And I wrote some notes, and maybe these notes would be helpful for you going forward. So I wrote design for disruption for a system that has already disrupted you. Design for the social, as Rachel Mbembe said, we are now um, at risk of losing the social altogether. The social is at risk of being obsolete. And design away from the white gaze, design for invisibility. Invisibility is needed if you are within disenfranchised groups. And design for prosperity, it's designed for people to live better and have material resources, but also designed for the retrieval of meaning. It's this position of being where you don't belong, but also not really having the privilege of attaching yourself to where you belong, makes it imperative that we create and produce and validate our own fields of meaning. And that's it. Maybe we can discuss if there's time. I know I went on and on and on. I just piled everything in.
No, that was great. I appreciate it. Thank you very, very much. I mean, lots of those issues that you were talking about are really front and center in our studio, and I'm hoping that that there will be some queries, especially from my studio, but from students in general. If not, I certainly have a couple of points to uh, to lay out on the table as well. So I will first turn it over to our students and Wallenberg faculty as well. If you have any uh, comments, questions, anything you would like to add. So I would also appreciate it if you all who are able to turn your screens on again. So it looks like we're having a conversation. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, don't be embarrassed. My daughter is going to come in and create a fuss in 5 minutes, so it's okay if things are. And I'm sure her hair is messy and she looks messy, and so don't worry.
Well, half of the people you're looking at don't have pants on right now, so it's fine. So, floor is open. Anyone?
I guess I have a question. You mentioned about buildings that crack every 7 to 10 years, right? And you said that they need to be rebuilt. It seemed like in the image that you showed us that the cracks were kind of patched and filled in. Is it like kind of like I mean, like, are they brought back to life, or do you really have to start over, move over, and rebuild the building completely?
Yes, that's pretty much what happens. You build wall by wall because people will not afford to just take down the entire space and rebuild it completely. And this is also something that not just in Nubian villages, because this was a big planning mistake. They just did not care to see the quality of the soil for a future of built environment. They just wanted to build that pyramid of theirs and just let those Nubians go and disappear. This is basically the issue. And what happens is that once you build, the soil gets any humidity and start holding, like pinching your foundations, and then a small crack would open, and then you repair it, and then it gets bigger, and you repair it, and it gets bigger, and you repair it, and the crack starts the next year of repair. So when you remove the entire wall, when you fix the entire wall, the next year the crack will start again. And it's note also Echelem Bembe, that for the second time quoting him, talks about Africa, how that repairing is against the linearity even of Western perception of time, is something that permeates everyday life in Africa. Every day we are repairing something that was messed up by the systems, the colonial and the colonial and the post-colonial that has performed colonial rules on this continent. That every day we are repairing something. And this is the case with these walls. It's basically just an Olympus pushing a stone kind of thing. It cracks and you repair it the next year. It's a lot of financial burden.
I guess my other question would be then, is there any way that you could use kind of different building practices that are kind of more adapted to this kind of different landscape that's not necessarily the landscape that these buildings were developed for, to kind of...
You're not allowed, because you don't own the houses. The state owns the houses. The state does not allow you to use any materials unsanctioned. They wrote a law, and the material of the house is part of the law.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Cool, yeah, that's
well, not cool, right?
I know, obviously. I am joking, I know.
Yeah, of course.
I have a question.
Yes.
So you talked about how sort of the outsiders brought in the paint to paint the houses and bring tourism in. And I was wondering if there was any way that the Nubians resisted the tourism culture. Yeah.
In the beginning, yes. In the beginning, they did not like it. And they were very aggressive, Nubians are known for being good-natured people. It's a Nile culture. And if you're by the Nile, it's just calm. It's just like serene. So they were aggressive in the beginning, but then they discovered that there is no way to make money in this area but to accept tourism. There's absolutely no, you will starve if you don't accept this. And this is the only way you can have funds to build schools. This is the only way to have funds to build infrastructure, because also those people don't own their land and don't own their houses. We are basically refugees within the same state.
Thank you.
I guess I was just wondering if you see any, if you see any way like forward or any way to change this kind of cycle. I mean, obviously it's like a governmental thing, but I was just wondering if through your research, if you see any potentials to help.
Return, the right to return and get our actual land in its vast surface back by the Nile and get to develop it and get to build Nubian wealth again. This was a forced displacement. It was built there. It was made with the intention of assimilating Nubians and having them kind of dissolve within the Egyptian government, Egyptian society, to forget their traditions and language and forget their identity and become Egyptians. So because there was a lot of anxieties. There was something called the Arab Nationalist Project. They wanted all of us to be Arabs, but we are Africans. As Egypt, even though it was an Arab country, an African country, it belonged to this Pan-African project. While Nubians who speak a Nilo-Saharan language and practice all these quintessentially African traditions or epistemologies did not fit into that larger scale. But we are not just speaking about it. We have been trying to return for years. There are 3 or 4 trials to return that has been retaliated on by the state. And the last one was, my family was involved in it in 2012 after the revolution. We could add an amendment to the Egyptian constitution to assure Nubian return again. So people started to go buy their land back and start farming. Then the state decided that this whole area is a national security area and people are not allowed. And they kicked everybody after we got all this land again. So there is always this, we try to go and they kick us away, and we try to go and we're not going to stop trying to go. And I hope they stop trying to kick us away.
I have a question about the tourism. How would you build for tourism, but also center it away from the white gaze?
You don't. You build for the story, not for the exhibition. So the thing is, why would you want to go and see that place? Why is it? What does it? Because it's about, so if it's about the exhibition, it's about something that it fulfills in you. For the Egyptian tourist in the north, this upper middle class Egyptian tourist, for them, it fulfills an idea that there is this serene area by the Nile with these very docile and lovely people who are dancing all the time. Happiness, happiness, happiness. Not remembering that this is a displaced population, just happiness. And they can go there and relax and just clean their souls. And then when they come there, for me to get that money from tourism, I have to meet their imaginary of me. I have to be that person they want me to be. So if it's about that exhibition and it's about that imaginary of the othering imaginary, it becomes epistemic and cultural violence. But then if it's about the story, so it's about the city making sense of itself or the place making sense of itself, and writing its own story. And then this story resonates with people who want to come and be part of it, or at least come and bask in its air, in the air of the story. The story is so important within African epistemologies. The story is dangerous. The story is how realities are made, a way of hegemonic systems. So making that story or fortifying that story is more important, and then the foot track comes for the story, not to meet their story or their imaginary. Does it make sense? Do I make sense a bit? Okay.
Do you think that tourists would be attracted to coming to visit things as a story? I guess like this isn't necessarily like for Nubia in general, but like in general, you think tourists would be able to like kind of find interest in those kind of things in like honest stories without like a grand social change kind of, and like yeah.
Have you heard of pilgrimage?
Right, yeah. But I mean, I think that's like a bit more different. I think pilgrimage is a bit more of a personal kind of tourism, right? As opposed to, I guess, kind of like explorative or cultural tourism. Like, do you think that people would still go there without the kind of Disneyland effect that people are kind of used to in tourism?
Yes, but here's the thing. if you put me in, because this is my conundrum. This is my conundrum in my villages. People are not going to come to me without the colors and the clownish shenanigans. So what do I do? Because the issue to begin with is the fact that I was pushed against the wall and have no economic alternative to meeting that imaginary. So how can I maintain the integrity of my own story? And it's not about making it compelling, but making it true and sincere and loud. And then this would be where people would want to go, because I think within your context there is so much connection. And I would think we go to the last village before the displaced land. So we would go and stare at a body of water underneath which our old land is submerged and cry. That's it. I have never seen it. I was born in displacement villages, but the fact that I stand over water and under this water, my ancestors in my history on my original land, and my right to a territory taken away is a very powerful story that brings me into just desert. It's just desert and a body of water. So the story itself and the conviction in it is so important. And this being the last community, and I was reading in how there's still language, Yoruba language, or I think most of the communities were brought from Benin in Africa town, from Benin. So there are still language there. That means there are still spaces that are hidden in that language. If I was there, I would want to go. I would want to go and see that, have that connection, have that last limb that is closest to a mother that I never had. So there are so many stories to validate, and these stories will have people who want it and want to see it. But to me, if you tell me, well, otherwise, it's either we build the clownish, how do I say it?
Disneyland.
The Disneyland. If we do the Disneyland, if you tell me you have no choice but to do the Disneyland, what I will tell you, well, you put me against the wall and you are now causing erasure. And now I have to erase my own history with my hand. It's like I'm gonna have to dig my cultural grave with my hand because I have nowhere else to go and I need to eat. So we really, as architects, need to know how to thread that needle very carefully.
Thank you.
So we're coming up to, we have about 4 minutes left in our planned talk. So if there are any final questions anyone has, we should probably get them in now. If not, I've got at least one that I'd like to throw out there, but I am much more interested. I can talk to Meena offline, but you have, this moment for yourselves. So please, if there's something that's hanging on your mind, please share.
Can I tell you one last thing?
Mm-hmm.
As I was telling you, Craig, I was doing research on the mastaba, the bench that kind of suspends the inside and the outside, and discovered that the porch in American architecture in the South was brought by enslaved African people. So Africa has produced, again, even on Turtle Island, so to give Native people their land back, it has reproduced itself and tried to blur the line between the inside and outside and bring the house outside and bring the street inside. Just wanted to remind.
Yeah, I mean, you literally can't find a home in Africa Town that does not have a porch on it. You can't find one. That just doesn't, they don't exist, except for, like you mentioned, state-built homes, like the housing projects that were built there by the state. But the ones where people have either built for themselves or helped build with other people. They all have a porch. They all have a porch. There's one point I wanted to maybe bring up, maybe have you talk about a little bit before we leave. Actually, two. One, you mentioned that it is in a sense in this process of building that you get to know yourself, you get to say, you name yourself, you get to, in a sense, encapsulate your values and your ancestors and your spirits. Could it be possible to sort of see this constant maintenance on these buildings as this process of continually rebuilding yourself or continually making yourself or making your community? I see it as, in a sense, as a burden, yes, because you always have to do it. But the flip side of that is, if the process of building is so important, that this is a way to sort of continually maybe not even reimagine yourself, but to revalidate yourself in a sense?
Yes, because my grandmother always has the option to move to Cairo. And there are always people in displacement villages always have relatives in diaspora. They could save this money and go live with these relatives and leave these villages altogether. But it's so important that this crack is mended. It's this fracture and this rupture is mended. And it's and I once asked my grandmother, "Are you going to do this forever?" And she said, well, I am going to die one day. So she's going to rebuild her walls until the day of her death. And then she said, then it's your role. It's your turn. You build it or not. Of course, she's guilting us to continue fixing the house. It's like African grandmother strategies all around, always guilting you into doing things. Like, when I die, it then becomes your turn. I don't know if you're going to build it or not, because this house is an extension of her flesh. If she dies, this house needs to be open for her to stay alive. So it's not, they're not just mending walls. They are mending a third skin.
Mm-hmm. And the last point I wanted to make was this idea about, designing for invisibility. That's a really intriguing statement. And I'm wondering, if you would like to say a little bit more about that. If not, no worries. I'm certainly going to bring it up with my students. That's not something typically that we as designers do, right? We want our work to be seen. We want it to be public, and so this idea of designing for invisibility is intriguing. I mean, I understand the reason why you're doing that is sort of it's kind of like protection. But the flip side of that is, that's not normally how designers think.
But then designers have other conventional practice, or how we were trained into architecture, has us in an exhibitionist complex all the time. We need to exhibit. But if we stop designing for the exhibition and start designing for the story, as I was saying, and trying to protect the story, it becomes strategies like designing for veiling or designing for invisibility become really important. And designing for mendacity and designing for trickery and designing for hacking, all these things that are seen as beneath us as architects, they don't go into our portfolio, are so important in protecting and allowing for cracks in the system. It's not because our role is not just to build within the cracks of the system, but to also create cracks within the system for future possibilities of erupting pieces of spatial productions within these indigenous ecosystems. Because if they don't have any other space within the state landscape, they don't have a space there. So for me, And how do I become displaced from where I have, how do I go about being displaced from where I have never been, is to adopt these techniques and these kind of tactics and strategies on how to find, not just build within the cracks of the system, but also create the cracks within the system to build.
Thank you. I think that's a perfect line with which to end this conversation, which has been wonderful. Thank you very much, Meena, for being here. I hope everyone, and I'm sure, I hope everyone enjoyed hearing this rather personal story. And I just want to thank you for sharing it. I mean, it's not, I know it can't be easy. And so we really appreciate your opening up and talking to us about this in a real way, not necessarily in an abstract way. So
I was very happy being here, and thank you for. If it was a bit hectic, sorry for that. I got too excited, I just piled everything there. Here's my grandmother's house, and here's yeah.
Yeah, well, family would do that to you.
Yes, they do. They do when they guilt you. Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. I hope everyone will join me in saying, appreciate the time. And I will be talking with you later. All right. Okay. Ciao.
Thank you, Meena.
Thank you, Meena.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.